April 14, 2001, history in the making. Nearly 2 years after the U.S. captured the 1999 Women's World Cup, those same players, along with the top international stars and emerging U.S. talent, launched the first women's professional soccer league. 8 teams, 184 players, 32 international greats representing 14 countries, one dream. RFK Stadium, home of the WUSA's inaugural game, shook with 34,000 fans. From the emotional pregame ceremony through the battle of Mia versus Brandy, the Bay Area Cyber-A's and the Washington Freedom set the stage for a season of firsts and a season of history in the making.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hello, gang. What's new? What's shaking? What's cooking? What's baking? How you doing, friends? It's Tim Hanlon, and I'm your humble host, your congenial host, your hostess with the mostest, shall we say, here at Good Seats. Still available, our curious little podcast journey each week, believe it or not, into what used to be in professional sports. I welcome you to the proceedings. Thank you for finding us, as always. Not always easy. In podcast land. We try to make it as easy as possible. God forbid, we're available just about everywhere you can find podcasts, for God's sakes. And we love it when you tell your friends and you share us on social media and push our newsletter to your pals, all that kind of stuff. But we welcome you back here, and we hope that we reward you, that's what he's trying to say, with a little fun-filled episode as we try to do each and every 7 days. We're going to stick with soccer because it is the World Cup after all. We've got World Cup fever. There's no doubt. There's no shame in it, frankly. Also, though, not just because of the sport of soccer, which we, certainly are guilty of going quite deeply on, but rest assured, friends, the next couple of weeks we've got stuff in football and hockey. We've got some more baseball coming up. We're even going to finally crack the code, we hope, on a little interesting thing called Roller Hockey International. And even World Team Tennis, frankly, finally, which has been sort of a long time pursuit, and we finally have a hook into the beginnings of that kind of conversation. So stay tuned for all that. That's coming up. But this week we're sticking with soccer, and it's not just about soccer. This week's episode, we also kind of want to highlight. We enjoy highlighting, frankly, people that were and are in the midst of the fun and the frivolity that we celebrate on this show. The teams and leagues no longer with us for whatever reasons, dearly departed and otherwise. But frankly, unsung heroes, people that you may just have never heard of before, but who have a wealth of information and know where, shall we say, many of the bodies are buried. And those in the know kind of know, but perhaps via this podcast, we kind of expose them and the very fascinating histories and stories and anecdotes and all kinds of stuff that they've got locked in their little troves of their brains and their experiences. And one such gentleman is, frankly, somebody it truly fits the unsung hero category, especially as it relates to this little podcast. His name is Thom Meredith, and he has been largely responsible, and we have to now publicly call him out for this now. A wide raft of folks that you've heard on this podcast, especially, but not exclusively, in the realm of pro soccer in this country. And we're finally going to give him his due and get some granulars, shall we say, from his experiences. And in particular, there are teams that we're going to get into the weeds of that we really haven't gone too deeply into, that this is a perfect excuse via our guest, Thom Meredith, to talk about. One is the Tampa Bay Rowdies, arguably one of the more successful franchises in the history of the original North American Soccer League, a very seminal one and very influential in the earlier days, if you will, of the NASL's ascendance into sort of a large and significant success as the decades of the 1970s rolled on. We also bounce along with Thom into the interesting story, the Philadelphia Fury. If you grew up in the Philadelphia area in the late 70s, you probably remember a whole bunch of rock and roll types like Leif Garrett and Paul Simon and Rick Wakeman and Peter Frampton. These were all people that were part of the ownership group of the star-studded, well, at least on the ownership side, star-studded Philadelphia Fury of the North American Soccer League, an experiment that you could make the argument went horribly wrong in terms of the attendance there, but it certainly was not without hijinks and interesting background, and we're going to get to that. The Dallas Tornado, we've touched on them a little bit, and the legacy and the just the tenacity of that team's founder and owner, Lamar Hunt, and we'll hear a lot more about Lamar Hunt's role, about his focus on keeping the sport alive and the Dallas franchise and all that kind of stuff. And Thom was sort of very much in the midst of that, and Mr. Hunt's support and background as well. And not the least, of course, in the early 2000s, we traveled with Thom into the world of the 3-year-long experiment known as the Women's United Soccer Association. This coming off the heels of a very successful U.S. Women's World Cup in 1999. We talked about that, of course, with our previous guest last week, JP Della Camera. But Thom was the PR and guy and whiz, if you will, for the fledgling WUSA, which certainly didn't lack for funding. But after only 3 years, wasn't around anymore. And so we're gonna hear those stories too. These are just some examples of the fun, interesting times of a long career in PR, in particular. Soccer, not exclusively, with Thom Meredith, the sort of unsung hero, if you will, of pro soccer over the last 30 years in relations to the PR game of the sport. And it's a very, very intriguing conversation, and I urge you to listen to all of it, and you will enjoy the bulk of it, I assure you. Coming up in a couple of seconds, so let's get a couple of promo items out of the way and get right to it, shall we? SportsHistoryCollectibles.com, one of our amazing sponsors and longtime sponsors. And as you know, probably one of the best places online to find things from the conversations that we have here on this show when it comes to teams and leagues and various sports even that are no longer with us, or perhaps are in newer or different incarnations, but left a trail of memories in their wake. And if you go to SportsHistoryCollectibles.com, look at all the great photography, all the items that are available. And if you find something that you're interested in, and I'm pretty sure you're going to find at least one item, I almost guarantee it. Nothing in life is guaranteed, but this is pretty darn close. When and if you do, I wouldn't even say if anymore, right? And when you do, make sure you use that promo code GOODSEATS, will you? Good Seats, that's the promo code, and you will get 15% off your purchases, all of your purchases, for that matter, at SportsHistoryCollectibles.com. Bookmark it now. Make sure you go. Give it a check out. It's going to be awesome. And don't forget that promo code GOODSEATS when you decide to purchase and get that credit card ready. And our other sponsor, of course, also long time, and we thank them immensely and we appreciate it. We had a few folks just last week actually sign up for this trial, and we appreciate it very much. And audiobooks are the thing to do when you're not listening to your favorite podcasts, or the streaming music service just keeps repeating the same old song over and over again. Why don't you get some audiobooks and put those in your queue? Why don't you? And the best place, of course, to do that is Audible. audibletrial.com/goodseats. That's the place to get your free 1-month subscription to the Audible service and a free audiobook download of your choice from over 180,000 titles to choose from. You can cancel at any time, and it's easy. It's no muss. It's no fuss. If you don't like it, hey, you cancel it, and you're no worse for the wear. But we do give you an ample opportunity to sample it for yourself. I'm pretty sure you're going to like it. And audiobooks are just they're just fun. They're a great way to kill time and learn and frankly get smarter about life in general while not straining your eyes in the process. So go to audibletrial.com/goodseats and get your free audiobook download and free 1-month trial of the service. And again, you can cancel at any time. We appreciate Audible for their sponsorship, and we absolutely appreciate you giving them a consideration and a try at that little site. Thanks a lot. All right, so let's smoothly segue into our very interesting, always is, conversation. I learned a ton from, again, one of the unsung heroes of professional soccer, the public relations angle of such here in the United States. His name is Thom Meredith, and this is our conversation that we had just a few weeks ago. Perhaps as we sort of get going, maybe you can give our audience a little bit of a sense of who this Thom Meredith guy is and why he's been so helpful to us in the realm of especially pro soccer, but pro sports and various incarnations of teams and leagues that for whatever reason, don't exist anymore. Who is Thom Meredith?
Well, I appreciate being a guest, Tim, and I love your podcast, and I've loved listening to your earlier guests. I think it's just that I've been able to last for 40-plus years, but I think I really need to thank, and I think it's a little bit of a lost art today, but I'm I'm a recipient of a whole bunch of folks, particularly early on in my career, that were mentors to me, and a lot of them have been friends now for 40, 50 years in the business. And in the sports business, it kind of goes around in circle. Usually the good folks that I know have been around in a lot of different sports, and I've just been real lucky to have a bunch of mentors. And I think the other thing is because I've been lucky enough, and it's all serendipity, is I think I've been lucky enough to be in a lot of different sports, American football, tennis, soccer, of course, which is my first love, in that I think I've taken things from the other sports and used them in my career in soccer, and then vice versa in American men's professional tennis, which I did when I worked for Lamar, etc. So I've just been real lucky. I've lived a lot of places. I have a great wife of 42 years who I met at a soccer game, and she's been very good to travel around the United States and live in 8 states to ply my trade, so to speak. I wouldn't trade it for anything.
Well, when you talk about the trade, so functionally, right, what would you would consider yourself largely as a promotion, well, more a PR kind of guy. That's pretty much your go-to skill set that you brought to the sports world over those many years, no?
Well, I started as a newspaper reporter, which is probably the great training that I had for a very small 17,000 circulation daily in upstate New York, the Oneonta Star, which was in the hometown of the school I went to, Hartwick, which is very well known for its soccer programs over the years. But I think that I started as a PR person, particularly early on in the old North American Soccer League teams and in men's pro tennis, and also with the U.S. Soccer Federation when I was one of the early directors of communications there, when it really was a fledgling national governing body. But I think from there, I evolved into really liking the organization part of the game, and for the last half of the career, whatever number of years that is, 25, I've been very lucky to be in the event side. So I'm an organizer, or the glue between stadiums, teams, promoters, and the organization of putting games on. I've done it for the Cricket World Cup. I did it I was lucky enough to be part of the college basketball game played on the active flight deck of a carrier in San Diego, and then, of course, all the soccer games that we've done recently and been lucky enough to be a part of and see.
Well, so it's also interesting too, I guess, as we sort of get into some of the weeds, and obviously some of the crazy stories that you've shared over the many months. I'm sure some of those will sort of come out here, but I'm curious, given your the longitude of your career, let's talk about maybe functionally the role of being a quote unquote PR person, and you're mentioning obviously both personally and I suspect as sort of a function in the industry, a morph, I guess, into PR being something much more, shall we say, polyglot, right? When it gets into presentation of events and maybe even social media. And I guess what I'm getting at is that the PR role of is far more maybe important and much more hybrid and maybe overlapping to other functions that might have been more, I guess, separately distinguished in the past, and maybe has taken on some newer life and meaning in today's sort of modern digital world. Is that a fair assessment?
Oh, absolutely. There's so many different aspects that have grown, changed, both in scope, numbers, attention to. Sure, we paid attention to the straight service to media when I was involved back in the old North American Soccer League days. But as you reference, it has certainly changed a billionfold on any level, whether it's individual professional team, the league, the one-off international game, a national governing body or a federation, and certainly the rise of social media. And I'm in no way, I'm an old guy, so in no way do I totally understand the social media aspect of today and how far-reaching it is. And as some of your previous guests have talked about, Jim Trecker in particular, in terms of, some of the things that we did in soccer and that happened at the Cosmos, for example, the advent or the idea that a woman was allowed in the locker room, which in those days, in the 70s, a lot of teams and leagues fought, or at least turned their back to, and now it's just happenstance. But certainly to your original question, the scope, the attention, certainly the attention for our sport has grown. When I started and I saw an ad in a magazine that had a soccer ball and a car ad, I would rip that thing out, and if I could find a Xerox in those days, I would Xerox it or copy it and send it to the 5 other friends that I knew that cared about it, and we'd go, man, we just had a soccer ball in a car ad, in a national car ad in the magazine, and now I don't even care. I don't even notice or keep track of the number of aspects or things or times you see soccer used as a selling thing. And then lastly, because of the involvement to the positive of the commerce part of the game and the money that's come into the game that helps it, and there's dark sides to that, sure. But the commerce that's come into the game requires everybody that's on the working side of the event to help with those commercial placements and the access to athletes, that it's just self-perpetuating and helps grow the sport. So that has really been different over the last 20 years in particular in this country.
Well, as we've done these silly little shows, there are a lot of themes that sort of repeat themselves and are underlying to a lot of sort of the evolution of stuff. And you're mentioning one, right? Money is obviously. I mean, we're going to sort of go back, I guess, and sort of get to your how you sort of originally adjuncted into this crazy sports world. But, I don't want to say it was sort of a quainter time, but it probably certainly was certainly when it came to the money and the business side. Now, that said, right, I mean, there are plenty of sports entrepreneurs that have been around for, the earliest days of professional baseball, for example, right, who have always been thinking about sort of the money and the businesses or business opportunities related to such sport. But the magnitude, we see it in today's World Cup or the U.S. getting the 2026 World Cup, right? I mean, promising FIFA something on the order of $14-15 billion in profit. That's just it's a light years away from perhaps when you even began a fledgling little PR and sports career back in the early 1970s.
Certainly, and it is a little discomforting. That's about as strong a word I'll use as some of the aspects in today. And I was a little bit uncomfortable as a fan seeing that promulgated, the $14-15 billion thing. But that's the world we live in. I still think that there is a certain code that I hope everybody adheres to in terms of doing the right thing, both on behalf of the sport and behalf of the people on both sides of the ball, so to speak. I might be old and I might be a curmudgeon, but I hope that is still part of what people think about. The other thing I wanted to insert is that the context is important. I've referenced 25, 30 years ago, and I would suggest that in some respects that's a lost aspect or people don't educate themselves as to what it was like in the old days and the players and things. You watch the NBA Finals, and LeBron is all of a sudden the greatest of all time. And I would say, did you ever see Jerry West or Wilt Chamberlain or Oscar Robertson play? Well, no, I didn't. Well, then how do you know that LeBron's the greatest of all time? We have a habit of doing that.
Even the comparisons to Michael Jordan, which is only a short generation away, right? I mean, the questioning of even that legacy at this, in today's modern, I mean, it does require a bit of a step back and a holistic view of things. And that's partially why we sort of do these shows, because not only is it important to sort of remember and learn from history and sort of see some of the seeds of things that exist today, which, this generation obviously thinks are brand new things and issues and events. but also recognizing too that that there's many things that preceded today's current world that arguably are part of the tableau and probably need to be considered after the event or the excitement of the immediacy of today.
Certainly, and I'll give you a segue to go back to it, but I know of a group of millennials that were meeting recently to discuss the milestones of my chosen sport of soccer, and they all agreed. There was only one person in the room over 50 years of age or 40 years of age, and they unanimously agreed that the greatest milestone in the history of the sport in our country, this country, was Beckham coming to America. And a friend of mine was in the room and said, well, what about 1975 and Pelé coming to the United States? Well, that doesn't count because A, there weren't enough eyeballs on it at the time, and B, that league went out of business, so it doesn't count.
Yeah, perfect discussion point, right? Because look, I'm not a historian. I just play one on TV, right? And nor am I an academician. And there are obviously more professionally oriented and heritaged people who sort of focus on these things. But it's not unlike general history, right? Mine is just a sort of a weird little slice of it, right? And teams and leagues that don't exist or have in previous incarnations, but it's all part of, right, the fabric of whatever the sports landscape is today. And it's ironic. I mean, I would have asked probably your millennial audience there, right? Where does the name Portland Timbers come from, right? Where we've heard of the San Jose Earthquakes. That wasn't chosen to replace the original name that Major League Soccer had for the San Jose franchise, right? It went back, decades prior, and it's a throwback, it's a callback, and there's a history there, and it's important. It would be interesting to know or hear the audience sort of respond to that, and maybe, frankly, not understand sort of what came before Major League Soccer and David Beckham.
Right. Well, a couple of points, too, and it happens today. I saw it with a story about the Eagles getting their Super Bowl rings, and emblazoned on the side of it is world champions. And that's driven me nuts for 50 years. If it's the World Series, they should play the Japanese in 7 games. If it's the NFL World Championship, they should play the Canadians 3 downs in a rouge. And I think it was, I'm a cliche guy, I think it was Kissinger who said once that Americans have 5% of the world's population and 95% of its sporting arrogance. We think that all of our sports are what happens in the rest of the world, and soccer is, and that was really what attracted me to the sport, to be honest, Tim, in the beginning, was the internationalness of it, the fact that everybody played it, and when you have a World Cup game, you have a German referee, a team from Iran, and a team from wherever, and when the whistle blows, they kind of all know what happened, and they might disagree with it, but they know a foul is a foul. And in the NFL, you need somebody to tell you 6 times, was that offside or encroachment? And I think that's one of the things that drew me to the sport.
Well, let's talk about that. So let's talk about how specifically you got involved, right? So let's dial the Wayback Machine to circa early 1970s, right? You're if I have this correct, you're essentially dropping out of college and joining the ranks of journalism by working at the Star in Oneonta, New York, and essentially being a sports writer, I'm assuming, and obviously having some exposure to a very powerhouse team in Hartwick College in the sport of soccer. Give us some sense of how you found soccer, or perhaps maybe even better described, it found you.
Well, there's 2 things. One is that through a family circumstance, I didn't start college regularly like other people. I skipped my fall semester of 1969, my freshman year at Hartwick in Oneonta, which of course has 2 schools there, Oneonta State and Hartwick, that were both good at the time and good in other sports as well. And I remember going to school in December, and there was this morose around the college that I just said, what's going on here? Did I make a mistake? Did I pick the wrong place? Because everybody was really downcast, and I'm like, I asked the guy that I got to know, I said, what's going on here? He said, everybody's so sad. And he said, you don't understand. this place cares. We lost to Harvard in double overtime in the NCAA finals, and that atmosphere carried over to the college. And that fall, when I went to games, the following fall, I remember vividly it raining real hard, and a guy was in our dorm was sick. They carried that guy's bed with a canopy up to the field, Elmore Field, which is uphill in Oneonta, so he could watch the game. And I go, man, what is it about that sport? And in terms of being introduced to the sport, some people have epiphanies, some don't. Mine was November 28th, 1970, a Eastern NCAA Division I final, Hartwick and Harvard, the same team that we had lost to in double overtime the year before, with people like Timo Liakoski and Alec Papadakis. And on the Harvard side, although he didn't play in that game, and he's still upset about the fact that he didn't, Shep Messing was a reserve goalkeeper. That game was 3-0 Hartwick at halftime, and we ended up winning 4-3 at the buzzer, so to speak. And I go, man, that's something I got to be a part of for the rest of my life. And as a part of being at Hartwick, I was a student SID, small school, and I got a chance to deliver news releases to the local newspaper, and I just got really infatuated with the whole idea of ink on paper and the smell and the sounds, and just being able to write something and seeing an hour after you do it, if it's 1 o'clock in the morning, you get to see your name in print. And I was lucky that I was able, when I was hired as a sophomore in college, to watch and cover Hartwick College's teams, and Oneonta State with Farouk Qureshi, and they won a Division II title at that time, in that time frame. Plus, we had a Class A farm team of the Yankees that was really good, and a whole bunch, and I was 28 miles from Cooperstown, the Baseball Hall of Fame, so I covered 3 or 4 actual Hall of Fame inductions. And so all that sort of led to me being really trained well. There's something when you're a 20-some-odd-year-old kid in those days, and it might be lost in some respects today, but there's something to be told when you come back from a game. I need 8 inches of copy, I need it in 20 minutes, and off you go. And if you don't, your story doesn't get it in the paper, and the next time the editor or the sports editor is going to give you a hard time. So that training about being on deadlines and being able to think quick. I saw my first dead person when I worked in the newspaper. I knew how to take an obituary correctly from a guy that had been doing it for 40 years. So you learn those sort of things, and that discipline has carried over for me, fortunately.
All right. So how did you stumble into this fledgling North American Soccer League? Because arguably, in the early 70s, right, it was, pro soccer in this country, right, had sort of gone through a life or frankly death experience, right, after a pretty amazing assemblage of people putting some money into it in the late 60s, and it frankly basically collapsing, and was really on life support in that early 70s. But how did you get snagged into what was then, I guess, a re-fledgling NASL and Pro Soccer League?
Well, through 2 people that we'll talk about quite a bit potentially here. One is Francisco Marcos, who is the guy who founded the United Soccer League system and should be in the Soccer Hall of Fame, in my opinion, in this country. He took me under his wing, one of those mentors, and he by his own passion of the sport, introduced me to the passion of it. And really, I'm a book-learned soccer guy. I didn't play. The other is Al Miller, who was the coach at Hartwick when I was in school there, and then went on to coach at the Adams. But Francisco also got involved nationally with the Federation at that time, also pretty fledgling and mom and pop. But he started a magazine on behalf of the Federation, Soccer Monthly, which probably was ahead of its time and certainly was a financial drain. But I wrote a lot of stuff and assisted him as the assistant editor of that magazine. And one of the things we did is we went to New York from Oneonta and interviewed Phil Woosnam in his offices of the old North American Soccer League, and then went to see a Cosmos game at Hofstra. That's 1972. And then Al Miller, being the first American, or the first in modern history American to coach in the professional leagues, went to Philadelphia. I never worked for that team, but I certainly went down with Francisco and saw a bunch of games and knew a bunch of the people. And that's how I got sort of introduced to the sport. And then in November of 74, it was about 10 degrees in Oneonta. It was snowing, and Francisco was leaving Oneonta to go be the first PR guy of the expansion Tampa Bay Rowdies in the North American Soccer League. And he said, why don't you come with me? Didn't have a girlfriend. Lease was up. Owned my own car. 10 degrees, 75 degrees, November. I go, I'm in. And we moved to Florida. And I helped him in a very small way, and it was a great experience, helped arguably the best brand next to the Cosmos potentially in that mid-70s period, helped him and the rest of the great folks in Tampa Bay start that team before the Bucs came along, and they won a championship in 75. So that sort of cemented my interest in the sport.
All right, so give our audience a bit of a sense of Tampa Bay. In 1974, it is an expansion franchise in a newly aggressively expanding North American Soccer League. Maybe you can give our audience a sense of sort of the time and the tone of Tampa Bay. You're mentioning before the Bucs came to town. This is obviously during the construction, or perhaps just after the construction of Tampa Stadium, the old sombrero.
Old sombrero,
right? And I'd love to give our audience a bit of a sense of what this Tampa Bay franchise kind of was in its early days, because it was arguably a seminal franchise over time in the NASL, and frankly indicative, I think, of the renewed spirit that perhaps Mr. Woosnam had given you during that first interview about how this league could be a national and international phenomenon in the years to come.
Right, I played a very small part in that start, but just being a spectator, so to speak, to the great minds. There were a couple of things. First of all, the Rowdies went to and I'm not being disparaging when I say this, the Tampa Bay, and it's always Tampa Bay, so it included across the bay St. Petersburg, Clearwater, as well as Tampa, but it was always a big, small town, even though it was very protective of its individual identities as an area. They were very clear that it was a Tampa Bay franchise. Two is there was no soccer there, so somebody like Francisco, who, again, I'm prejudiced, I'm biased, he's been maybe my biggest mentor in 50 years, is that he helped start the youth association there when there was really no soccer. There was a little bit of adult soccer, so he started a team in that league, and his team beat the perennial St. Pete Kickers a number of times, so that gave us, on the amateur side, the adult side, some added credibility. But the folks that were involved in that team, from ownership, George Strawbridge, who was an heir to the Campbell Soup fortune, to Bo Rogers, who was the GM, Marty Rockberg, the marketing guy, Francisco, Eddie Fermani was the coach, who then got spirited away to the Cosmos, as you know. But they didn't have rules in terms of, or didn't follow the norms. You know, soccer's a kick in the grass. They had a song written. And the guy who wrote that song, Soccer's a Kick in the Grass, an advertising firm in Atlanta and Tampa offices, he'd never seen a game. They just did a lot of research and made it fun, and it was a great thing to go to. And again, they won a championship 2 years before, or a year before the Bucs started, which helped a lot, right, in terms of timing. And I think those stories were repeated in a bunch of the markets around the country, whether they had a team like the Tornado that maybe was around from the 67, you referenced the USA, the original situation that occurred in pro soccer in this country after 66 World Cup, where two competing factions fought it out, and there were not many left standing after that. But you had Dallas, you had San Jose, you had Portland, you had Seattle, and Chicago with Lee Stern. Those teams came up and filled the void, I think, for a number of places that either in those days couldn't be or wouldn't be, or were priced out potentially of other major sports, whether it's the NFL or Major League Baseball, or in some respects the NBA. And it became the young thing to do, the place to go, to have fun. And they didn't subscribe all the time to all the cultural and athletic norms in those days. Not nefariously, just in terms of having fun. And I think that that's probably the major thing that really made Tampa work and and they had great rivalries with Fort Lauderdale and the Cosmos, as you know. And I think that all added to it.
Would you say that the arrival of that team in '74 cemented, or maybe even got going the opportunity and or rationale for the NFL to finally expand there in '76 with the Bucs?
Well, it was about the same time. One of the great trivia questions of all time is that the original owner of the Buccaneers, when that franchise was awarded in June of '74, was not Hugh Culverhouse, the Jacksonville tax attorney who eventually got the franchise and played games '76, '77. The original owner was a guy named Tom McCloskey, who ironically was the Adams owner in Philadelphia. It was a builder and who Al Miller worked for, etc. And because of some family issues, for the first time in that memory, and maybe hasn't happened too many times, McCloskey had to give the franchise up. So that was a little bit of a blip. But again, I think that back to your original question is I think that the fact that we opened up that market to professional sports, and a team from Portland would come. They didn't have professional sports there except for spring training and that kind of stuff. So they really helped, and the media was very receptive. Francisco again was sort of like the Masonic approach, that he really was very energetic, knew his business, and just sort of dared them to come and watch them, and they would have a good time, and they saw the fun. The media saw the fun that the people had, and they embraced it. St. Petersburg Times and the Tampa Tribune, Clearwater Sun, and the television and radio stations. So it all added to it. It was a perfect storm, and I think it's one of the great franchise stories of all time.
So as we say, so let's segue into '75, right? That's you found yourself then going to another team for the bulk of the 1975 season, just up the not just up the road, right? So you're back up to the East Coast and the Washington Diplomats. How does that happen? And I guess it's largely because you're getting known and circulated, shall we say, in what is now a quickly expanding NASL.
Right, and again, I have to thank Francisco Marcos for this. There was a league meeting in Tampa. Again, it's a nice place to come and visit when you're meeting in the wintertime. And they had a league meeting, and they had Jim Carvelis, who you know of from the Cosmos days, was the managing partner of the Washington Diplomats team. Thanks for calling it the Diplomats and not the Dips. Us old guys for the Dips. And diplomats don't like that other term. But he was looking for a PR person, and Francisco said to me, I don't think you're ready yet, but go and have fun. And I went, and that was when Pelé came to the NASL, and we had a game in June, about a month after he had joined the league, and we drew 35,000 people to RFK. And people took notice, and I had a good time. We had probably one of the most fun experiences of my life was being part of a team where Dennis Viollet, a very famous English player, still holds the record, I believe, for most goals scored for Manchester United in a single season, and he was the coach of that team. And I'm not sure what was more fun, the games or the post games, where Dennis would, if you couldn't laugh with Dennis Viollet, you didn't have a sense of humor, and all the players were veteran English league guys, and they played hard, they played hard, and it was just a great experience to ply my trade, Washington Post and all of those things, where you trial and error, you figure out what works or doesn't. And it was all part of the learning process for me.
All right, so a couple of things to unpack there. So let's talk about Jim Carvelis, because as a kid, right, my first and deepest knowledge of him was obviously being sort of the voice of the Cosmos, and from a little bit here and there in '76 and '77, but then more full-time-ish, I guess, 77 and onward, right, literally was the voice, along with Seamus Mal, and a little bit of Howard David Pryor, and in years prior. So, but I do, in my sort of crack research, do keep hearing and seeing his name in the earlier years of soccer, right? And you're mentioning he was a general partner, I guess, in this Washington Diplomats franchise. But maybe you can give a little bit of background of what his background was, because how are you a broadcaster, but also an owner, I guess, or he obviously was involved in sports and/or sports promotion. Is that true?
Well, I'm not sure how much money he actually put into it. There were actually, for the original Diplomats, were owned by some insurance guys in Silver Spring, Maryland. But Carvelis was a very, very good play-by-play guy and was the sports director of a Washington TV station. Also did the Baltimore Bullets games, West Unsung, etc. Baltimore Bullets games for a number of years on TV and radio, and it was so fun to be with Jim. And by the way, he was Greek, so he had some background or love of the game, I think hereditarily, because Greeks do. But I never asked him what his reason for being involved in the sport was. I just knew that he loved it. He loved being around the athletes, and he liked just being a part of it. And that's really one of the few. I just don't know why he did it, but I know he had a direct interest, and it would be really fun to be in an office with him and say, Jim, give us 3 minutes of Baltimore Bullets, and he could do a play-by-play off the top of his head, and you would just go, man, that's as good as watching Musburger or Schinkel or anybody in those days. And he had great pipes, as you remember, so he loved the sport.
Yeah, no doubt, great pipes. I've had this conversation with a bunch of folks. Our episode with JP Dellacamera, which will be posting as we record this sometime later next week, and he recalls, JP does, sort of listening to in later years growing up with the voice of Jim Carvelis. And if you go back to some of those old YouTube clips of those Cosmos games, those games, and perhaps this is sort of through the halo or the filter of sort of a lost childhood and youth, right? Okay, so fair assessment. But those games hold up, right? And his broadcasts of those games hold up. And I said this to JP, I think, arguably some of the current announcers for Major League Soccer, let's say in this country, could benefit, because the way that he brought sort of professional chops, right? Good pipes, but also a good sense of, not only sort of like when to sort of, ramp it up, histrionically for a match, but also kind of knew sort of how to play the tone and the timbre of the game. When to lay out, when not to, and arguably, I think he's probably one of the better soccer, if not the best soccer broadcaster of a generation that maybe shows folks how it could be or should be done.
Well, 100%, and you reference him not speaking, and us old guys always think that the things that we saw in the 70s and 80s is better than today. But I'll give you one example for Carvelis. I'd ask your listeners to go to the same YouTube and listen to somebody that I met, because he did the preseason games for the Buccaneers, but was very famous back in the 60s, but would never make it today. Go back and listen to Ray Scott, the NFL announcer, do football games. Man, you would go 30 seconds without hearing something, but Ray Scott was as good as it got to me in those days, and I think Carvelis was one of those kinds of guys.
Yeah, I think underrated, and as the U.S. Soccer Hall of Fame gets rebooted in the fall, I would hope that one of the themes that they could sort of go back into is sort of the history of soccer and broadcasting in this country. And I think at that point, once that's some time is spent on it, I think you'll see Mr. Carvelis pop up and arguably on that short list, perhaps, of some of the pioneers that could be recognized or should be.
There should be a broadcaster's list. You also mentioned Seamus, and the segue back to that Hartwig game that I referenced. And Seamus and I have talked about it a lot over the last 40 years, because he was an assistant coach. He was 50 years at Harvard in the admissions office before he retired, and then he obviously moonlighted, so to speak, as a sports announcer, soccer announcer, so you know him from that. But I've spoken to Seamus a million times about that 4-3 Hartwig game, and his answer always is one that I love and I use when I speak at different things about Hartwig stuff. And he said it was the best day and the worst day he ever spent in the sport. The best day, because it was, as I think it was, and again, 40 years or 45 years makes a lot of difference. I think it's the best athletic contest I've seen in my life after 60 some odd years. And Seamus will also tell you it was the worst day because he said on the entire and this happens all the time in sport, but he still remembers it, the entire bus ride back to Cambridge, nobody said a word. They were that devastated losing that game. And the year before, when we lost to, when Hartwick lost to Harvard, Alec Papadakis, who now is the CEO of USL, has told me many times, and he played in the NASL 5-6 years with a couple of teams. Alec has told me many times that game was the toughest loss he ever experienced in his athletic career. So people care about that stuff, and I'm glad they do.
Well, another guy that should be in that short list is Seamus Mallon. I mean, again, you go back to Carvelis and Mallon calling those games, and I think many people of a certain age sort of remember those games and hold them up as the gold standard for. And look, the Cosmos were a gold standard on a number of different fronts, but broadcasting was absolutely one of them, and hopefully it's rediscovered as the years go on and as we sort of look back at what is a rich history between soccer and broadcasting at this time. Let's go back to the Rowdies, though, because you did. After that 75 season with the Dips. I guess I also want to get some thoughts about what you were seeing during that time, right, which is a crucial time, right, the 3-year period of time that Pele came to the league, became the sort of traveling circus throughout the league, but also was the backdrop and perhaps the foundation for what then now was 18 going on 20, and then ultimately in the latter part of the decade, 24 teams. I mean, it's almost like a miraculous, rise for a Phoenix rising, if you will, without Phoenix, of course, the actual city, into, something that was only 5 teams in 1970 and 71. What was your sense of the NASL during that period of time at the Dips and with the Rowdies? Give us a sense of what you sort of saw. I mean, did you, what was your understanding of this league and what its future was? Because it certainly seemed to be growing by leaps and bounds and a whole lot of enthusiasm behind it.
Yeah, and it's the benefit of 40 years as well, isn't it, Tim, that when we were involved, when I was involved, Francisco and whomever it was at various franchises, we didn't think of what this is going to be in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. I mean, unfortunately, that it's still hung on us that the people in those times in the mid-'70s said, we're the sport of the '80s or the sport of the '70s, and we're not there yet, but we're getting closer in terms of being a mainstream. I have a whole bunch of ideas about that, but in those days, I don't think we really understood it. I remember, I'll give you one example. It might not be germane here, but I remember flying later in that period when I was with the Philadelphia team, and we were flying to Oakland for a game, and I'm sitting next to Johnny Giles, the famous Irish player and former coach, etc., played at Leeds in the English League, and I said, Johnny, you've been here for a week. What do you think of North American Soccer League in the United States? He says, the country's too bloody big. 5 hours to get across country for games, and I think that's still the issue. But to your question, I just think that the folks that were involved, there was a sprinkling of people that had cut their chops, so to speak, as you referenced, in other sports, predominantly baseball in particular, and got involved in soccer. But most of us were young. Most of us were relatively green and inexperienced, and we just found our own way. Sometimes we didn't do well. Sometimes we did very well. You could make the statement just like it is in the English League now. Is Manchester City good or bad for the sport? In those days, were the Cosmos good or bad for the sport? I personally believe that, as you and Jim Trecker talked about in a previous podcast, I personally believe it was good for the sport because it brought us coverage nationally, even though it was a New York team. And I think it gave us some credibility because Pelé is still Pelé. And I think that it really helped broaden the appeal for the average fan to maybe try us. But in terms of thinking about what the context was, I'm not sure we did a lot of thinking about that. I can tell you the other part that kind of makes me laugh today, where when you have an Ibrahimovic come to the LA Galaxy and they go, wow, he's 34 years old. Why is he coming here to, this is where old English players come to die, etc. I would submit to you that anybody that, again, took the time to watch those teams play, if you found a more exciting player than Ace Netzelengwe from Minnesota, who I think was the most complete player I saw in that league, irrespective of my friends in New York, or if you saw some of the guys that played in other teams in other places. The Vancouver teams in those days were very good with the Leonarduzzi brothers, etc. And so I don't make any excuses for the quality of play that the majority of teams had in those days.
How about the traveling show that was the Cosmos, right? So you're in Washington and in Tampa Bay, and we'll get to some of your Philadelphia experiences in the latter part of the 70s in a minute, but maybe even with the Fury as well. Give me a sense of sort of the, I don't know, it feels like both pros and cons, right, of a date or two with the Cosmos, either with or without Pelé, depending on what year we're talking about. It almost feels like the arrival of the team for a game in those respective cities is sort of could be the best of times and then arguably the worst of times, given when the circus leaves town and the remainder of the season beckons. Any insights on sort of that sort of phenomenon?
Well, absolutely, and I will say in Tampa's case in particular, the best of times were when the big bad Cosmos came to town, and we had some really huge games with those guys in 76, 77, etc. The good news was that the home team, Tampa, won a lot of those games, whether regular season or playoffs in particular. So that adds to when your home team wins in any sport, any league, any time, that helps you. And a couple of the folks, and one of the things I learned from even though I had no impact in those days in scheduling of games, but I learned it in later years during the women's league involvements that I had, is we had some big time players, whether it be Mia Hamm or Brandy Chastain or whatever, and everybody clamored they wanted to open the season with one of those players because it jump started your season. And I had a couple of pretty smart friends in that league who said, I don't care if they come to me second or third. I know I'm going to do well at my opener. I need help in games 2, 3, and 4. And that's what you learn when you spend some time in that. But certainly winning when you're exposed to that. But the other part of that original question is, in terms of Pelé, when he came to town, Jim Trecker and the Cosmos, and he talked about it on your podcast, is that it transcended just the regular media or sports media, and you had the news side covering it because it was a big event when he would come to town because of the fact that he was a national or international symbol and certainly a national hero in Brazil.
When it's clear though that Tampa Bay seemed to do quite well in addition to or beyond sort of the Cosmos showing up for a game or two. But probably that was not the case as much in a number of other cities, right? You can make the argument out of Vancouver and Seattle and Minnesota and right, some other very successful sort of franchises. But for every one of those, right, there was dare I say it, a Philadelphia Fury, for example, right? Which seems to me like it was, part of that sort of hyper extension of the league from 18 to 24 teams circa 1978, where Phil Woosnam, had, I don't want to say stars in his eyes, but certainly a more North American wide map, right, to potentially become more interesting to national television and all those kinds of things, arguably maybe ahead of its time. But maybe we'll use this as a convenient segue into the Philadelphia Fury escapade, because I think it's emblematic of the other side of all this growth and attraction and media attention and fan interest, because not every team in the North American Soccer League circa that era, right, 24 teams, was as strong and as stable and as well rooted as, say, the Tampa Bay Rowdies or Cosmos, right?
Right. I'm going to use Lamar Hunt. I'm going to insert him in the conversation here. And I always learn from him, with my experience with him, that you're only as strong as your weakest link, which is going to play to this answer and to your question. And a lot of those folks at the Fury aren't around anymore, so I guess they can't chase me for being negative. But I think they are, in some respects, a poster child for what not to do. And there's a number of reasons for that we still see today, in my opinion. And there's certainly back to why that happened, and it was a matter of, I think, although you'd have to ask, unfortunately, he's passed now, but you'd have to ask Phil and other people involved why they wanted to add 8 teams or 6 teams in 1 year, et cetera. And it was, I think they felt that they had to broaden that national footprint, big country, so it's hard to do for the television side, because the conventional wisdom was, if you're on television, you've made it. And I've always believed that bottom line is the fannies in the seats first, and then the television follows rather than the other way around. But that's for a athletic sociologist to say. But in terms of the Fury, the folks involved were predominantly from across the pond. We had a very good general manager, Bob Ellinger, who was a veteran of the Adams, and he was recirculated, or so to speak, but in a nice way, as a GM of the Philadelphia Fury. But these owners that were mostly in the music business, including some of their stars, and I saw Peter Frampton and Rick Wakeman and Paul Simon and Leif Garrett at games, but I think it was their surrogates that were using their money to promote that team. And it's well documented that on the way into the news conference to announce the name of the team as the Philadelphia Fury, there were a number of people in that ownership group that were arguing that they wanted the name Furies, F-U-R-I-E-S, and that kind of let's be positive, the dichotomy of thought or action that you could never. Once you got a consensus, the next day somebody would say, well, what about doing this? And then they'd change. So it was very hard for Bob Ellinger to sort of navigate that. They argued about a coach until the time that they hired a guy from the UK that was a school teacher. That got much maligned in Philadelphia, which is a tough market anyway. And then the second coach they hired was a Yugoslav guy who was the nicest person on the planet, but in Philadelphia didn't speak a word of English, and that limited yourself. And then on the player side, because these owners, Englishmen in particular, were all fans of their respective teams in the UK, predominantly Spurs, Chelsea, etc., their idea was to relive their younger years or childhoods and bring some players to the Fury that possibly shouldn't have been on that team in terms of effectiveness at the age where they came across. And all that was the perfect storm or hurricane in the opposite direction, and it was just a tough thing to overcome.
Yeah, that seems like a crazy story, right? Among many crazy stories of ownership in that league, but it sounds to me like it was more the music management teams of folks like Leif Garrett and Paul Simon and Wakeman and Frampton than it was maybe that they were minority investors and or sort of, shall we say, promotional eye candy for that, right?
Yeah, vehicles. That's right. Yeah, but it didn't change. To be honest, Tim, and we'll go far ahead and then come back, but it didn't change in the WUSA. The first women's league and John Hendricks from Discovery is a very nice man and a very smart individual. He's done very well for himself, Discovery Channel, et cetera, et cetera. He convinced his partners to be involved as owners in the WUSA right after the famous and really successful 99 Women's World Cup in this country. He convinced a bunch of folks to be involved that were his cable television buddies. Some of them saw it as simply programming for their cable outlets. And I remember vividly having a conversation with one woman who was a senior person in a big cable company that's still around in this country, and she and her co-business people at that particular outlet, which is it's in the news today, happens to be headquartered in Philadelphia, so you can figure out who that is. And they thought that they were getting involved because of asset franchise appreciation. And they thought it was within 3 years they were going to see, help me, NFL-type numbers for their franchises. And I don't know what they were smoking, but that's just not the way it works. So that's part of the idea as well. Back to your NESL days, and it runs a gamut. Pro sports is a tough business, and you have some people that are very good at it, like we were in my opinion at the Rowdies in Tampa, and for a while the Cosmos with Steve Ross, who loved that whole glitz and glamour thing, but it still comes down to doing the 9 to 5 or the 6 to 6 work every week, right? That you got to sell tickets and do the marketing and do all the other stuff. And some people did it and some people didn't.
All right, just when it was getting interesting, let's bring this to a grinding halt, shall we? Just kidding. We got to pay the bills around here, and our friends at Audible have been very helpful in attempting to allow us to pay some of those bills, and we want to call them out now and remind you that a free audiobook download is yours for the taking, and also a free 1-month subscription to the service of Audible at audibletrial.com/goodseats. Again, audibletrial.com/goodseats for your free 1-month trial of the Audible service, and most interestingly, a free audiobook download for you to enjoy. 180,000 titles and growing every day to choose from, and there's absolutely no excuse to not find at least one title amongst that cavernous selection available to you that you won't find to be enjoyable and good for the soul, including a couple of books that might be interesting to our audience. And yes, some new ones, frankly, that I'm finally listening to. One that I'm listening to right now is by Carson Cunningham. It's narrated by Paul Bamer, and it's called Underbelly Hoops, Adventures in the CBA, a.k.a. the Crazy Basketball Association, which is really, of course, about the Continental Basketball Association, which for many years was sort of this ragtag minor league of the NBA. And it's a book I'm about 2 chapters into right now, and hopefully maybe a guest will get for a future episode. Also, in my queue, next up, is another guest that I'd like to get, and her book that she wrote is also narrated by her. Her name is Jeannie Buss, and of course, Jeannie is the daughter of Jerry Buss, of course, the wildly successful founder of the Los Angeles Lakers and the LA Forum, and Jeannie is clearly today the brains behind the Los Angeles Lakers today. She and her brothers were active, of course, in things like, along with her father, World Team Tennis, the Major Indoor Soccer League with the LA Lasers, all kinds of stuff. So her book is next on my list. That's called Laker Girl, and that too is available on Audible. And again, it's one of the many thousands of titles that you can choose from when you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats. And again, you too can get your free audiobook download to give it a try, perhaps one of those 2, or perhaps one of the other 180,000 titles available to you as well. Give it a try, audibletrial.com/goodseats. Thanks for listening, and back to our conversation. How tough was it to sell NASL soccer in Philadelphia when you were there in 78, 79?
Well, it's, again, everybody likes to say that their market is the toughest. I don't believe in that, but certainly faced, as I was as a young 27-year-old PR person in the city of Philadelphia with, the Eagles and Vermeil, the Sixers and the Flyers, and baseball. Pete Rose had come to the Phillies at that time, and they were very good. So you had a lot of competition for the sports dollars. I don't think it's any different today, with all due respect, and I know them very well. I don't think it's any different today than what the Philadelphia Union MLS team is facing in a city with the Sixers doing what they did, the Eagles doing what they did, the Flyers making the playoffs. And so it's always, you just got to fight through that and do in my opinion, what you do best and work hard at it. But in terms of working in that market, I'll give you one example that I remember vividly. Is Bob Ellinger came to me one day and said, we want to make an announcement this week. And of course, he always thought of it as, in those days, we thought of it more as how it was going to play in the Inquirer and the Daily News, the two newspapers there. He said, what day of the week should we do this announcement? And I go, I don't know. He said, well, go find out what circulation rates are, or what circulations are for every day in the week. And I go, why should I do that? But it was a great training. Found out that, obviously, 50% of the people read a newspaper on Sunday, and the least amount of readership was Saturday, and the other strongest day of the week was the day the coupons were in the paper, Thursday, usually. So we made an announcement on Wednesday to be in the Thursday paper. And that's the kind of thing you learn, and maybe it was trial and error in those days, but some people had good mentors like that, and some didn't.
It felt to me that the Fury, in '79, I think was the least attended team of the league, right? 5,000 plus. But it also, right, was, and the year before was a little bit better, but not all of them. I mean, they were clearly near the bottom rungs on the attendance front. But I'm curious as to whether the difficulty of selling within Philadelphia, given all the other things going on in the sports world around that time in Philadelphia, but also it seems to me that just the team was relatively subpar. I mean, it never had a winning record. It squeaked into the playoffs in '79. Another question I want to ask you, because I got to think it's somewhat memorable, right? Because in '79 the team posted a 10-20 record, and through the interesting variations of the North American Soccer League points system, just eked into the playoffs and knocked off the second best team in the first round of the playoffs, the Houston Hurricane. I'm just, all that sounds really interesting to me.
Yeah, so there's two anecdotes there. One is, yes, we did go to Houston, which was coached by Timo Liakowski, who was a longtime friend of mine, an All-American at Hartwick. And we beat them down there. I think it was 1-0. I don't remember the score. But Timo, post-game, wouldn't speak to me. And for months wouldn't speak to me about losing that game, because we had no business winning, but we did, and we made the next round, et cetera, et cetera. The other one I remember is I almost got fired because, yes, we made it on the last day of the season. A Jersey kid named Pat Fidelia scoring a goal. We won 3-2. I think it was in Montreal. And made it literally on the last kick of the last game of the season to make the playoffs, squeaked in. And some general manager from the West Coast, and in those days we used telexes to communicate, he sent an all-league telex out to everybody in the league saying, hey, somebody answer, when is Philadelphia's first playoff game? And I wrote him back. I shouldn't have, but I was young and impetuous in those days. I wrote him back and I said, please send the date and time of your first playoff game. Well, his team hadn't made the playoffs, so that rubbed him the wrong way, and he went to the league office, and I almost got fired for it. And bad idea, but it felt good for about an hour, I can tell you, when somebody gives you grief for that, because we just went the way the rules were, and we made the playoffs.
Very interesting. So going from the Fury, right, I guess you thought that, did you see, you left after the second year of the team, and then I guess they had one further season after that. Did you see that it could be successful in Philadelphia, or was it, at what point did you kind of sort of, making the playoffs in that run certainly helped. I got to think the next season would have been some momentum for that. Obviously, you left to go to Dallas after that, but it almost seems like it almost went even further sideways the following season, given even lower attendance, if that could be achieved. Did you sort of see the seeds of the team not lasting much longer in that city, or was that just again in the moment, not sort of paying attention to that?
No, it wasn't. That wasn't as much for me personally, to be honest, as it was to be reunited with in Dallas with Lamar Hunt, who I'll talk about in a second, and then Al Miller, who was the coach, and Francisco, again, two mentors of mine Francisco was the player personnel director, and et cetera, et cetera. But that came about because when I worked for the Buccaneers, and the Pro Bowl was in Tampa in February of '78 before it went to Hawaii for its long run and then came back, obviously, to Orlando or whatever the heck it is. But there was a big party of all the NFL owners in that February of '78, which we as staff of the Buccaneers could go to. And standing by himself in the middle of the room, I went up and started talking to Lamar Hunt. Nobody was talking to him, and we talked soccer for literally the 25 or 20 minutes that I met with him. And literally, whatever that time frame is, a year and a half later, my phone rings and it's Lamar Hunt, and he says, in Philadelphia, he says, "Tom, I remember the conversation we had at the resort about soccer, and we need a PR guy. Would you be interested?" I'm like, Lamar Hunt remembers a conversation that he had with me? But as I found out over the next 35 years, that's the way the guy was. He was just one of the best human beings, probably the best human being I've ever met in terms of just being a quality human being. So that's how that started, really. It was nothing to do with what the future of the Fury was. And my wife was from Philly, so that didn't go over very big when we moved to Dallas. But it was really a case of just, and I got a salary increase, so that's another reason you move in our business or any business. And it was a chance to work with Al Miller and Francisco, and they had an established, pretty good team that only got a little bit better.
And history, Rich, right? The tornado. So let's talk about Mr. Hunt and the tornado specifically, because I'm obviously curious about, we had Kyle Rote Jr. on our show. We've had Bobby Moffett. It's pretty clear that the tornado, while never a huge success on the field. I mean, there was that chance in '73 to win the championship, which they lost to the Adams, frankly, I think by everybody's surprise. But was always a solid club and a solid performer. Maybe not necessarily gangbusters in the stands, not necessarily sort of a breakthrough on the national level, but it arguably that sort of at least air of stability. Because of the fundamental belief that Lamar Hunt had from the earliest days about the future of the pro game in this country, and I think as long as he was sort of involved, Dallas, to his credit, would be part of that North American Soccer League. Maybe a few moments about Hunt, the tornado, and sort of its and his role in all of this.
Well, there's so many positives to that, and you're 100% right. And yes, they did win a championship in '71, which at that time I think was the longest games ever played with Rochester. I think they won 170 minutes or something like that. But that core group of Kenny Cooper, Bobby Moffett, Mike Renshaw, etc., a lot of them English expats that went around the world on that famous Around the World tour that they did as a Dallas Tornado team when the team first started.
I want to do a separate episode on that one. I do know that somebody wrote a book on that, and that just seems to be a very interesting story for its own thing. So
it's fabulous, the places they went and the experiences they had over 5 months. But the positives are, and there are other examples of this in a lot of different places, Minnesota, San Jose, Seattle, that come to mind. But I'm not sure if, and I don't think you keep a score on it, but I'm not sure there's another community or area in this country that benefited from a soccer standpoint and the grassroots standpoint of the work and the visits and the clinics and the camps and the various things that those disciples, those prophets did in their spare time in Dallas, Texas, than did the tornado. And yes, you had Lamar Hunt, who is arguably, I think he's the greatest American sportsman. Again, I'm biased. I knew him for 35 years and worked for him for whatever it is, 7, 8, 9. And there's not a better human being and another classier human being than I've ever met than that man. But he's always a guy that, for whatever he would never be a Steve Ross. I remember shifting gears. I remember talking to Dick Vermeil before he went to the Chiefs, Lamar's NFL team, and asking him in those days, this is in the 80s now, how come the Chiefs will never make it big? And he says, because Lamar is too cheap to pay assistants, good assistants, what they're worth. Now, that all changed when they had some change in the boardroom at the Chiefs, not from Lamar, but their general manager, presidents, etc. But Lamar always believed that you were always as strong as your weakest links, and he didn't want to, I think it was in his DNA, not to flaunt his economic power, and so they never spent the money that potentially that other teams did, Cosmos or Minnesota with the 3M and General Mills guys. So that's part of it. But in terms of the positivity and I believe I could say with some degree of authority that I don't think there's any city or any area that benefited more from all the years of their work. I think Atlanta is another one. I think you're seeing the fruits finally of what's happening in MLS in Atlanta with all the great work that the Chadwicks and those kinds of guys, David Chadwick, did in the Atlanta thing. And then lastly, I'll say that to the detriment, and all right, every market's the same, no market's different or better or worse, but in Dallas, that is a Cowboys team and a Cowboys country, first, second, third, and then you have college football, a great line about the two different seasons of football. There's, football and spring football in college, but that had a lot of effect on it. You're really fighting uphill. And thirdly is in the summertime, like right now, it is really hot in Dallas, Texas, and we played in a variety of places. Lamar, I think his teams over the years played in at least 5 that I can think of off the top of my head. And when I was there, the big move was made to move from Ownby Stadium on the campus of SMU, his alma mater, which was an open-air place, and we moved to Texas Stadium playing on turf. And it was, I remember in 1980 living there, the temperature didn't go below 100 degrees for 24/7 for 41 consecutive days. And that's awful hard to get people to go out and sit watching a game in those conditions, but that's no excuse.
No, had a good team that year, right? Won the division and won the first round of the playoffs, and got knocked off somewhat dramatically by the Cosmos later in that season. You do mention the stadium history of that team, right? I think it's like 6 or 7 actually stadiums. I mean, there's the old Turnpike
right.
Stadium.
Starting with
in
the Cotton Bowl and some other places.
So what as far as you remember, what precipitated that move from Ownby, which is arguably closer to the Dallas sort of core downtown area, or at least relatively close, to arguably a much more suburban and or metroplex-ish Texas Stadium? Was it the modern amenities? Was it we need to upgrade our sort of thing? Was the Ownby Stadium too narrow? Any idea as to why that move? Because I could see the pluses and minuses of making such a move.
I think it was first and second, Tim, and not much of the third. I don't think the field width had anything to do with it. I think it was more that, centrally located, so let's draw from Fort Worth, the mid-cities, etc. And I think it was, hey, we're playing in the house that Tom Landry built with the hole in the roof, and people have a familiarity with it, and let's try to increase our visibility with that. And, Lamar had a number of general managers as well. All of them bring a different perspective and a different approach to it. At the Ownby years, at least at the end, he had, and he's still around, you should chase him, Dick Berg, who was in San Jose, and then in Dallas, maybe the P.T. Barnum or Bill Veck of his time in the North American Soccer League. He was the GM and no holds barred at Ownby, and they did pretty well, had a pretty good team with Jeff Bourne and some other players. Then Al Miller went very German and had some German players playing at Texas Stadium, and Dick had left. Another guy came in who I work for, Kent Kramer, and people have different ideas, and Lamar was very good about listening to other people and supporting his staff, and those decisions were made, and so off we go.
Well, so I guess I really want to get into the 1981 season, right? Because that's when the bottom kind of fell out. I mean, the Tornado, I think, only managed 5 wins in 81. Barely reached 5,000 or so per game. And at the end of the season, I guess Hunt and team recognized or gave up or had enough. Right? I guess based on my research, I think at the time they were sort of quoted something in the neighborhood of $15 to $20 million over the decade plus in losses. Can you give our audience a sense of sort of what the 1981 season was like and why this longtime champion of the sport professionally in this country, I don't know, by all accounts, seems like he gave up or was pretty much done with the NASL?
Well, there were a couple of things with Lamar, and then there were a whole bunch of other more not important but more integral to this discussion that happened with the team. So first, from the Lamar Hunt side, and this is, people can read their Wall Street journals and follow this. As you might remember, this is around the time where, and it wasn't Lamar, it was his two brothers, William and Bunker, tried to corner the silver market in this country, and that caused their family as a whole bunch of internal and external problems with the government and IRS, a bunch of things. Number two, Lamar as a person involved in a whole bunch of different sports, including, and people always forget that he is still, his family, first Lamar and now his family, were the original investors and the original majority investors from 1967 in the Chicago Bulls. Lamar was very proud of the 6 rings that he had as that owner, and never met in his entire life before he passed away, never met Michael Jordan. Had a bunch of chances and decided not to because he was superstitious about it. So Lamar's other business at that time was WCT, the tennis outfit. He was being sued by the Pro Council and the so-called other aspects of the men's professional game, which took up a lot of time, a lot of money. You referenced the 15 or 20 million, which is, that's a lot of money to anybody, but he lost every bit of twice that, if not 3 times that, in his time over about the identical period in men's professional tennis. So those pressures weighed. Then from my perspective, as I remember, and I have a little bit of benefit of time, but some of the details might be a little cloudy. But so there was another that change I talked about in terms of the leadership of the team, and Coach Al Miller left. He quit in the locker room the previous season after losing that crazy Cosmos playoff game, and another guy took over who was the logical choice. Nice man, I knew him for a long time, still good friends with him, who had played for the team, and he was the assistant coach. Great story. Great number 2, not sure how good a number 1 he was, and they didn't have a very good team, and there was friction between him and the general manager. So he got fired. They brought another guy in to be the coach, and it just continued to go south. And I don't know if it was as much as characterized as Lamar, quote-unquote, throwing in the towel, but he had a chance, and what they eventually did, as I remember, was join forces and combine their teams with the Tampa Bay team at that time, and the assets of the Tornado and its legalese and economics, and I wasn't privileged to that, but I think he thought that if he was going to at least downsize, he could be a part of arguably one of the better run or the most visible of the franchises in that league from 75 to 81. So, and it was the short-lived because obviously it went out of business not soon after that.
Well, it's also around the time that you kind of stepped away from soccer as well altogether. I'm sure. I mean, I know you were tangentially related during your WCT days, obviously part of the sort of the Hunt orbit, and obviously then brought sort of into the sort of U.S. Soccer Federation for years later worth of work, right? But the pro game, right? Certainly, arguably, you got an early seat in the sort of maybe beginning of the end period of the North American Soccer League, and I'm really curious to hear, say, in the years that sort of followed, certainly 84, 85 by that time. Now, I guess firmly ensconced in the the USSF and other parts of the sort of broader soccer hierarchy in this country. What was your assessment and or perception, and frankly, maybe gut feelings about what ultimately became the demise of the professional league? And I remember it very vividly as sort of a very dark period of time, right? Where, having grown up and being entranced by this North American Soccer League, having it all basically go away, you kind of wonder what the hell the future of the pro level of the sport was going to be in this country, right?
Well, the sport across the board, it was a very dark period, as I think you've had some guests that talked about previously as well. It doesn't need me to amplify it, but again, you're in the foxhole. You don't think about what the end of the war is going to be. All you want to do is get through that day or week or month. But it wasn't that negative just for me. It was just the fact that the league goes out of business in '84. You have that erstwhile attempt to get the World Cup in '82 that wasn't well done. You have a number of other people dropping out as owners of the North American Soccer League at that time because they just didn't see the future of it, and there was other things happening in their lives across the country. And from a national team standpoint, and I started working, as you referenced, a little bit with the Federation at that time, and I attended and worked that. And my wife always said I had it backwards. I would take vacations from Lamar to go work for the Olympic Games in '84 and do some other things. And she said to me one day, "You have this backwards. Would you please go work for those guys so we can take normal vacations with our kids?" And she was only half kidding, but there was some truth to it. But there was the bad qualifying loss to Costa Rica, so we didn't qualify for '86, and there was no big time Division I professional outdoor soccer at that time, and it was a very dark period. And even though there were a core of us that loved the sport and just liked being involved and followed the game internationally, it was a very difficult time across the board, and wondering whether there was going to be a renaissance at some time in our lifetime, because certainly in those days, you're 100% right, it was a very dark time.
Yeah, but there were also some flickers, right? Whether it was the 1984 soccer tournament, part of the Olympics, right, and that massive crowd at the Rose Bowl in Los Angeles, in Pasadena. The qualifying finally in '89, the shot heard around the world in Trinidad and Tobago, and making on our own merits, right, the 1990 World Cup. The reception of the actual hosting of that 1994 World Cup, right? Probably, I think it was a year earlier, back in '88, '89-ish. So it didn't die, right? It was sort of there, and our, the idea that the sport would not sort of go away per se. Maybe you can give some thought as to the mindset of folks that you were around in the Federation at that time, as well as perhaps the importance of those events, the qualifying, winning the opportunity to host, and what I don't think is explored all that much, the sort of seeds of what is now Major League Soccer, right, which was part of the legacy guarantee of winning that bid in the first place in '94.
Right. There's a whole bunch of history that's forgotten there, in my opinion, Tim. And let's talk a little bit about the thing that did flourish and really kept some of the flame alive. Okay, it wasn't outdoor soccer, it wasn't the rest of the world type soccer, but as you know, the Major Indoor Soccer League was really going strong at that time with St. Louis, Dallas, and a bunch of different places. St. Louis is the one that comes to mind with the Steamers, and then and certainly Dallas, the Dallas Sidekicks were big, and I remember, and this is sort of the disdain that some of the leadership had. When I first started working for the Federation, one of the first trips I took was to take two senior executives from our Federation to a sold-out reunion arena for a Dallas Sidekicks Tacoma Stars indoor playoff game. I think there were 4 or 5 members of the National Board of Directors of U.S. Soccer, the national governing body, who played in that game. It's in the top 5 athletic contests I've ever seen in my life. I mean, the noise was incredible in that building. And Dallas won in overtime, but in the middle of regulation, late in the game, tied, the 2 gentlemen with me leaned over to me and said, "Anytime you want to leave, we can go." And I'm like, "What?" And I, again, being snotty Tom, I said, "Well, I have the keys. Can I strongly urge us to stay until this is over, because it'll look really bad if you 2 guys leave before this game is over." So the indoor league had a foothold, and at least the ball was round, and people followed that. And then going forward, I'm going to insert a couple of things that, yes, 89 was big, 80, 89, 90, going to Italy, etc. But there were some things that were occurring over that time as well. Our team qualified for the Olympic Games, which, as you know, we haven't done the last, 2 quadrennials, which is a blot as well as it is for not qualifying for Russia. But the 88 team in Korea did very, very well. We were unlucky to lose to Argentina. We drew with the host country 0-0. We played true professionals in the Soviet Union and got spanked 4-2, and that was in 88. Also, the previous year, 87, we played in the Pan Am Games. And all those, to me, because I worked them all those experiences added to the player, the administrative, and the coaching acumen that we needed in 89, 90 to go forward. We play in the Pan Am Games in Indianapolis, and if you look at the scoreline, it's 2-0. We lost to Argentina. We win that game. We go to the next round. That game was 0-0 after 85 minutes, and I'm sitting because if we had won, CBS and Brent Musburger was going to do the next game on TV as part of they had the rights to the Pan Am Games. And I remember vividly sitting with Brent Musburger the entire game, explaining to him and telling him in the second half, "Brent, this 0-0, this doesn't happen against Argentina." Then we gave up a penalty at 87, and they scored, in essence, the hockey-type empty netter at 90, and we lost 2-0. But it was really close, and that's what happens when you play those games. And we got better because of it. So there's a lot of history there, in my opinion, that adds to that whole time as we continue to grow towards 90 and then 94.
How did you get ensnared into the beginning days of Major League Soccer? You were more of an independent, running your own firm and doing a lot of work with lots of teams and leagues and federations and that kind of stuff at that point, if I'm not mistaken. Were you part of some of the sort of preliminary bricklaying, shall we say, for the pre and then earliest days of Major League Soccer?
Well, one of the great things that I was able to do, first of all, I was working for the Federation at the time in that time period in the 90s, which was a very busy and very fruitful time with the U.S. Cups that we had done 92 and 93 with England and Brazil and all these teams coming here as trials and dry runs. We also had a very strong, obviously we had a very strong international friendlies period of time, and I was working for the Federation, and I was lucky. I saw 26 of 52 games live, and I saw a game in every venue in 94, and so that added to it. But as I went around the country, one of my jobs, or my primary job for 94, I didn't work for the organizing committee at the time, but my job through Hank Steinbrecher and Alan Rothenberg, the Secretary General and the President at that time, was to help put games on, stage games in these markets that were going to have World Cup games in a couple of years hence. So I got to know a lot of the people that were in place there, both at stadiums and at teams, and a lot of those guys flipped over, so to speak. Dan Flynn in Chicago became obviously the Secretary General of U.S. Soccer, but he was in Chicago. There was Farouk Qureshi was in Orlando and then worked in Tampa, etc. So I got to know those folks, and then just it's like any other business. It's relationships, and I talked up involvements and got to do a lot of those things, a lot of those games, and got to know those folks, and were able to do a lot of things for those fledgling teams in those days.
How did you get into the WUSA? We kind of hinted at it before, but I guess I want to sort of segue into that, right? Because obviously Major League Soccer had gotten off to a pretty darn good start and centralized ownership, and clearly things were sort of on the up and up. But obviously the 1999 Women's World Cup and the sort of second shot heard around the world, in particular the famous sports bra and Brandi Chastain at the final in the penalty shootout and all that stuff, and a huge shot in the arm and momentum for the women's game. Maybe you could give, and you had a ringside seat of this, so I'd really like to hear your impressions of the impetus and the excitement behind launching the women's professional league, that being the WUSA circa 2000, and maybe a little bit of sort of the why perhaps that enthusiasm sort of waned relatively quickly. And we mentioned money before, ...
Well, you're right. You're right that one necessarily and for sure led to the other. The absolute captivation of this entire country with the Girls of Summer 1999, and it was a fabulous time. I think I knew that it had arrived when I was at a game on a World Cup game on the West Coast. I can't remember. I think I was going from LA to San Jose or vice versa. And I was lucky enough because American Airlines was a sponsor at that time, although I paid for it. Big notice, I paid for it. I upgraded myself to first class. And every one of the men sitting in first class of that flight the morning after we had won the semifinal game, so it had to be coming from San Jose to LA, every one of them was reading the San Jose Mercury or the San Francisco Examiner, and every one of them was talking to their seatmate about the Women's World Cup team. That's when I knew that we had made it, quote unquote, as an event in this country, when those guys were talking about it. And certainly that euphoria, that exposure, the quality which still exists of the personalities of that time, Brandi, Mia, all of them, Carla Overbeck, Brianna Scurry. So they were quality people, quality times, and that led to folks saying, hey, maybe we can make a pro game out of this. Tony DiCicco was the obvious choice, or at least somebody who said that he wanted to be part of that leadership. And John Hendricks again, and the other folks that were involved, said that, and knew that Tony was one of the folks that should be involved. Tony was the commissioner, so to speak, on the good side. It was also his idea, and he pushed for it very hard, just like the administrators and Alan Rothenberg and Marla Messing had done so during '99, pushed for, as you know, playing in big stadiums, Stanford Stadium, the Rose Bowl, which 3 years before you'd have been shot for saying we should do that. But it turned out to be the right answer and the right thing, and the crowds were big and vociferous and enthusiastic, and it exposed not only women but who hadn't been to many games before, and boys to the international game and the sphere of that. So then Tony was the leader of that, and asked me. I was working for the Federation, and asked me if I would be interested in moving from Chicago to New York and work as the startup for the WUSA. I liked doing different things, to my wife's and family's detriment, because we moved again. But I think that Tony was the right guy, and certainly we harnessed or used that enthusiasm for '99 going forward for WUSA, pregnant pause. Then I think, and I could be part of that same group of people, but they really didn't know how to market the sport, and really didn't. Sport marketing, to me, it's grunt work. The successful folks are the people, in my opinion, that do the simple things and the mundane things over and do it right, over and over and over again. And a lot of those folks, in my opinion, they thought it was just fun and games. I remember going to a general manager's meeting before the first season, and the folks in the room were all laughing and having a good time and talking about the old days in '99. And I just needed, of course, I was the cold water, I guess, at times. And I said, folks, let me just say something here. A year from now, when one of your teams doesn't make the playoffs, some of you people will not be in this room. That's what pro sports is about. It takes scores and keeps track of things pretty quickly and pretty effectively. And whether I had an impact on them or not, I don't know, but I was probably too much of a naysayer, only that it's really, to me, that a lot of those folks didn't know how to promote what they had.
Well, I mean, you're just talking about a sizable, I mean, it would seem on paper, right? You know, having $5 million each from Time Warner Cable, back when it existed, Cox Enterprises and Cox Communications, Comcast, the big bucks of John Hendricks, and Amos Hostetler. I mean, you've got, you could not have, media, right? Turner. It seems like you could not have had a better foundation to launch in earnest, right? A successful professional league. The players that were there were not only just the top women of the U.S. game, but the top women on the world stage as well. And this was literally, and maybe even more interestingly, right? So I think one thing that's kind of lost in all this, right? The one thing about soccer in this country professionally, unlike most of the other professional league sports in this country, right? Whereas soccer is not either arrogantly or actually the top sport, and nor is it the top league in the world like it is with all the other sports, obviously baseball and American football, et cetera, right? But you can't, this was actually an attempt and an opportunity, literally, to create the best world league for women's soccer based in the United States, it seemed.
And I'm going to make a statement to you, and I just saw somebody the other day that was an assistant coach in one of those teams in that first year. And hey, I'm not a technical guy. I'm an ops guy and a PR guy. But everybody, I think, that paid attention to that league would tell you that from a quality standpoint, I'm not taking anything away from the current NWSL teams and folks. A couple of them are still involved from when they were involved in the WUSA, Tommy Sermani, et cetera, ex-national team coach of this country in Australia. But I would submit to you that the quality of the players in that first and second years is better still than anything that's been put together in the rest of the world or here since that time. Now that costs money, and maybe and I include myself in maybe we didn't do a good job of keeping the two sides of the ledger balanced, what we spent and what we took in. WAGs have said to me over the years, oh my God, $60 million. How could you have spent that much? And my typical Tom retort sometimes is, how much should it have cost? When you start a new professional American gridiron league, as they're trying to do again, come back to me and tell me what those guys are going to spend to start that in competition with the NFL. It isn't cheap, and maybe we spent money we shouldn't have, but I would tell you that from a product standpoint, it was certainly the equal, if not better, than anything that's been seen before. I'll give you one example of, I won't tell you who the owner was, but a number of years after the demise of the WUSA, I was in a group with this particular original owner, and he said, maybe I'd have been better off hiring Christine Lilly and paying her $1 million or $5 million to come to my house twice a week, instead of what he spent and lost with the WUSA. But hey, maybe it was before its time and didn't do a lot of things right, but we have to be blamed for not having all of us, the right people at the right place, pulling the oars in the right direction and having everything fall into place. But I don't think it was because of the lack of the abilities of the players. I think they were spectacular.
All right, so maybe we as we round up here, there was probably nobody on the PR side of the pro soccer game in the United States that's sort of had more of a bird's eye view of the sport and its evolution over the last 30, 40 years than Thom Meredith. Give us some sense of, given all of that history, given all that sort of in the trenches and sort of seeing the good, the bad, the sideways, the ugly. I'm really curious to hear, I think our audience would be too, as to where sort of you see the current state of the professional game in this country. Certainly Major League Soccer, but also the soccer pyramid that seems to be growing. The state, though, of the openness or maybe lack thereof, what of the next generation of the NASL, what of the USL, what of the world stage? I mean, 2026. Is it good? Is it upwards from here? Is it challenged? Does it potentially not survive, let's say, an economic downturn? Have we reached too many teams a la the old NASL again? I'm really curious to just hear sort of your general assessment of where sort of the state of the pro game is here in this country from your perspective.
Well, I'm going to try to do it in less than 3,000 words because that's a big topic.
No, the podcasts allow for lots of lengthy explanations, so don't be shy.
The short answer is I am very, very optimistic, but we are in challenging times. The sport is challenged, and it's challenged every day. But first, let's talk a little bit about, it's like what's Valdano say, where you are, where you want to be, and how do you get there type of a thing. It's every day there's going to be challenges. I have a little bit different view than Dan Flynn, for example, who came out recently on the day of the announcement of 2026 coming here, that we have to get our team right and have to get the on-field product right. And I believe, as a guy that's never played the game, I'm a book-learned soccer guy, I believe that the other parts of it are equally important. And, the next time you see a soccer person or a professed soccer person, and we have garnered and attracted 50 times what we, in terms of the people that are watching, and I don't necessarily use Nielsen ratings as a barometer of how much we've impacted the lives of Americans. I tell my friends from across the different ponds all the time, anybody that says that soccer, football, is not part of the fabric of American life is not paying attention, has never been here, and doesn't know and hasn't traveled around the country and seen the impact of kids playing. But it's not just kids playing. I went to a Division II women's game here in Connecticut where I live. I really like watching this team play. And I was sitting with a gal who's the regional referee coordinator for, she works for a state association, but she also works on the refereeing side, former FIFA referee on the women's side, refereed in the WUSA. And we have this unbelievable proliferation of teams and leagues and first, second, third. I'm not even going to get into the pro-rel thing because I personally don't think that's ever going to happen in terms of the current MLS structure. I just don't think those owners are going to go for it, that single entity thing. So I don't even get involved in that. But when I was talking to her about what's going on, it's more a question of where are the coaches. I mean, we do a great job with the players and the coaches. We're talking about getting all these coaches involved and all these pathways. But what about the administrators, which is a link that we don't talk about too much? And I've referenced a number of times over this conversation about the lack of foresight, ability, history, context of those folks. And what about referees? What are we doing to attract people? Both my kids refereed when I was working for the Federation in Chicago. And both of them came home the first Saturday they worked and said, "Dad, please don't make me do that again." because of the way parents acted, etc. And that's the 800-pound gorilla in this country. But today's referees, and we have a hard time attracting them, we have a hard time keeping them, and so there's an attrition rate there. As an aside, and it's happening, and I'm really interested to see this modern development, I always said, Tim, that my sport of choice has not arrived in this country like it has in England and South America and any other place on the planet until you can bet on a soccer game. Until I can open my paper today, this morning, and see that Red Bull is favored over Atlanta. Now, I think it's going to happen because of this proliferation of the sports betting situation that's happening right now. I don't think anybody knows where it's going to end up. But I've always felt that aspect of it would be the final brick on the wall of our sport making it. But there's a context. We referenced it on the beginning of the conversation. And I'm a cliche guy. Those that do not study history are doomed to repeat it. And I can't tell you. Well, I'll make a wager. I'll ask somebody, because I won't be involved in it, but I'll ask the folks that are going to be involved in the creation and the staging of 2026. The 1994 folks spent a lot of time and a lot of energy putting books together that I don't believe have ever been seen about what was the reasons, what were the success parameters, and how they did certain things for the, whatever it is, 6 years from 88 to 94. And they spent a lot of time on it. How many, I'd like to ask those guys on July 4th, 2026, how many of them read that document? Now, maybe there was nothing in there that was germane, but from a context standpoint, you referenced it earlier. Anybody that's involved in the game, and I'm as involved or as guilty, I should say, as anybody. I remember Al Miller and Seamus Mallon and Jim Carvelis. Those guys are important to me. Phil Woosnam. And the average person today doesn't have any idea the sacrifices. Referees. I mean, a guy like Gino D'Ippolito, who did a lot of Cosmos games in front of 70,000 people, was as good a referee, in my opinion, as the folks working today. And very few people know that guy. He was a simple carpenter who lived in Yonkers and worked on the building of the Verrazano Bridge. And he would leave early, ask his foreman, "Can I leave early? I got to go do a soccer game." And all of his buddies would laugh at him, yeah. And then 3 hours later, he's getting yelled at by Canalia in front of 70,000 people, and his average guys didn't know it. Those guys and gals built this game, and I think there's something to be said for at least asking them their opinions. And I don't get asked very often. I appreciate the opportunity to spout a little bit with you, but I back to your original question and my beginning of my answer, I'm very enthused. I think there's a context. We can never think that we've made it. I think we have to continue to do the simple stuff. I think we have to, everybody has to do their part. And I think that the game is the most important thing. And then to, in our own ways, trying to correct some of the things that we've seen. And again, they're little things, but I believe the educational part in terms of, I've already written the email and the letters. When I see somebody say, well, earlier this week in the Wall Street Journal, they did this great 2-page spread of the World Cup. Really well done. That wouldn't have happened when I started, right? And they did a synopsis of every team. And you go down and I read them, and it says England, colon, inventor of the game. That's not true. They didn't invent the game. They promulgated and codified the rules at Freemason's Tavern in 1863. But they didn't invent the game. Nobody knows who invented the game. We think the Chinese played a game very similar to what soccer is today in 3,000 years ago. It's not the World Series. It's not the Eagles did not win a world championship. And until we get, and I think it's coming, but until we get more, and I'm on a soapbox, I'm sorry, but until we get more and more people that understands the internationalness of the game and what it means when women can't go to a game in Iran. You've seen the signs at this World Cup that promotes that, et cetera, et cetera. Until they understand how it fits into the fabric of everybody's life and the rest of the world. We're all lamenting the fact that the U.S. men didn't make the World Cup, and it's a disaster. I don't see it that way because the Italians didn't make it, and I don't think it's going to be, sure, it's a short-term disaster for them. They're still arguing about who the president's going to be of their federation, and et cetera, et cetera. But I don't think that it's the death knell that some short-term apologists make for my sport. The sport's healthy. It's growing. We got to keep doing what we're doing and having a big tent and let everybody in and listen to everybody. And lastly, I would say that most of the time, and again, I'm probably in the minority as well, most of the time, and I answered somebody who wrote me the other day and asked me this question, most of the time I believe the successful things in this country, or in sport at least, are in business. I mean, you could argue the success of Jack Welch at GE or Iacocca at Chrysler, and certainly in sport, I wouldn't necessarily call him a dictator or a benign dictator, but you can't argue against the success of Pete Rozelle at the NFL, David Stern at the NBA, etc. And I think that it's very hard to get a consensus today. It's very hard to get people to agree on a way forward that potentially 49.9% of them don't want to go. And then if the 50.1% wins the argument that day, the 49.9 say, oh, I'm not going to be involved anymore. It's a long-term thing. So the sport's the most important thing. The grace of the game, what the game teaches, and what the end results are. Not only just winning the World Cup, but just putting on something and showing the rest of the world that this country has joined the rest of the world from its sporting standpoint, which I still think we have some way to go before we can say we've graduated from that master class, in my opinion, anyway.
Well, look, that's spoken like as someone with a true understanding and true experiences in the game, and this is partially why we do these conversations, because to your point, history is part of the human condition. And, I think it's interesting to sort of see as generations sort of continue to unfold, some of the problems looked upon as being sort of new and unforeseen. And all you have to do is look back a generation or two and sort of see some of the same issues and perhaps how those were successfully or unsuccessfully tackled in the past. And look, I also think a couple of things. So number one, 2026, right, is an amazing not only jolt to the system and a reinvigoration, I guess, given sort of the divots that we've experienced in the last 18 to 24 months in this country with regards to our success on the world stage. But it's also a guidepost. It's a mile marker. It's something to shoot for on a number of different fronts. And frankly, I'll put words in your mouth, or at least I'll claim them as mine. So I'll get on my soapbox for a second. I'm actually very intrigued. And I think the timing now even makes even more interesting fodder of the reboot of this National Soccer Hall of Fame in Frisco, Texas, which, as you know, is relaunching in earnest in September. But it feels to me, right, after a lengthy absence, it is a supreme opportunity to re-energize and full bore go into all of these various, I don't even call them nooks and crannies, let's call them tributaries of history, on a more formal and sustained and visible basis. that for whatever reasons are not only celebrated, but at least remembered, right? I mean, we've talked to people like Doug Verb and Mark Menchel, for example, about the MISL, right? I mean, the Major Indoor Soccer League, whether today's outdoor or the USSF or whatever folks, want to or don't want to recognize it, the reality is that the pro sport in this country was largely dominated by the indoor game in much of the 1980s. And to ignore that or not remember that, is, I think, an injustice. I think we talk about broadcasting, right, which seems to be a silly sort of little separate thing here. But it's important because, it goes back into the history, like the 1960s, where are those tapes of the CBS games and stuff, and 1966, right, which is a World Cup thing that kind of reintroduced the sport on the world stage to this country. I mean, these are all things, what of Francisco Marcos, right? I mean, the USL or the USISL or the Sizzle or all these sort of right. Little leagues and acronyms that we can't even remember anymore. Without those grassroots efforts of his and others, a lot of the stuff that we, I think, relatively benignly argue about, right? Pro-rel. And I mean, we've got a huge infrastructure now that, you couldn't even imagine 10, 20 years ago. My only thought is that a true, robust, open, and insightful Soccer Hall of Fame and a commitment or recommitment to your point earlier, the very deep and vast history of this sport. I mean, the old American Soccer League and all its permutations. What if even the professional version of it in the 70s and early 80s, right? I mean, there was a lot of quality players there, but people ignore that or have forgotten it because the NASL was so big. And these are all things that to me seem very timely, given a nice 8-year window where the world stage will be focusing its attention on this country and this continent again. So
let me do a real quick.
Yeah, please.
Let me do a real quick response. I'll try to, because you hit a lot of them, and I'll try to do it in reverse order. So the first thing is, you're right about the old ASL. How many people, for example, have been to Boston Common in Boston, Massachusetts, and gone to the obelisk? There's an obelisk. There's a statue there that highlights the fact that there was a club called the Oneida Football Club that played soccer. I have a picture in my house here that Lamar Hunt had hanging the original. He had the original. I have a copy of it, of Union soldiers playing soccer at parade from Harper's Weekly in 1862. I have that picture. So you go to the Boston Common today, there's an obelisk talking about the Oneida Football Club that was undefeated and unscored upon, playing their games from 1862 to 1865 on Boston Common, part of the history. I will say to you about the Hall of Fame, and of course I was living in Oneonta, being a part of that scene, working for the newspaper. I was very proud to be involved in the early machinations of the Hall of Fame when it was just the thoughts of a bunch of different people there. In terms of, because of the strength of the two programs, Hartwick and Oneonta State, and then we got the building there, et cetera. So I was part of that, and sad to see it go, but economics. The museum business is a tough business. Let me just tell our listeners here a fact of life in the museum business, which is difficult at best today. And this is true. If it wasn't for a lady named Jane Clark, who is part of a big fortune in Cooperstown, New York, Major League Baseball does not financially support the Baseball Hall of Fame, the oldest and best known of our halls of fame. And Jane Clark writes a big check every year to cover that shortfall. And by the way, the president of the Hall of Fame is a guy named Jeff Idelson, who was Jim Trecker's number 2 for the World Cup in PR. So he's a soccer guy. The Football Hall of Fame almost went out of business in Canton, Ohio a couple of years ago. The biggest moneymaker they have is when the two NFL teams play a preseason game there. You might remember, I don't know how many years ago it is now, 5, 7, where they had a major rainstorm and the game got washed out. That almost bankrupted the Football Hall of Fame, which the NFL, a bazillion-dollar business, doesn't give a dime in support to. So, and the viewer interest of kids and attendees who are going to go to this Hall of Fame have changed over the years. I'm an old timer. I love looking at memorabilia. I've given a lot of stuff from my collection because what am I going to do with it? I've sent them a lot of stuff. Insert. There's somebody who I know has been involved in, and maybe they were 4 steps removed from that recent work on the Hall of Fame, but it goes back to my original point about geography and knowledge. So they were writing a cut line for a piece of memorabilia, which happened to be, I think it's Frankie Borgi or Charlie Colombo, one of the 2 guys from 1950. I can never keep them straight, who wore gloves, welder's gloves, not the goalkeeper, but this guy wore gloves when he played on the field in the 50s. And they have a pair of his gloves. And the cut line reads, these are the gloves that Charlie Colombo wore when he played in the USA's 1-0 win over Great Britain in the 1950 World Cup. Now, you just can't make a mistake like that. It's not Great Britain, it's England, right, etc. So, those kinds of things, we still have miles to go. And you're right about Francisco. I'll just put it in simple terms, and we should talk to him someday. Francisco regularly, or over his career, didn't chase the Division I. He did the Division IIs and IIIs. How about a guy that has talked to 150, round numbers, pick a number, 100, 120, 150. He's talked to 150 people in this country and says, join me on this crusade, throw some money in the pot here, I'm in charge, but you can be part of this league or that league, women's league, PDL, whatever. And he did that for 25 years, and now it's the USL, and his college classmate Alec Papadakis is now running it. So those kind of guys deserve some credit, and somebody should ask them a question here and there about how did it happen in those days, and maybe you learn something.
Okay, there it is, our chat with Thom Meredith, one of the true unsung heroes of pro sports in this country over the last 30-plus years, and in particular the sport of soccer. And we'd even talk about some of the other exploits that Thom had in his career, including, by the way, being the PR guy for the very woeful Tampa Bay Buccaneers in their first 2 years of existence in the NFL. I'm sure another story for another day. But again, people like Thom are to be not only remembered, but also celebrated for, frankly, doing a lot of the work in the trenches during the, certainly fun and frivolity-filled times of soccer when it was sort of fledgling and choppy and exciting, but yet not necessarily guaranteed in terms of success. There are people like Thom who are, frankly, instrumental in not only keeping the history of this sport alive, but its future as well. And I mean it when I say things like the National Soccer Hall of Fame coming back online in October down in Frisco, Texas. It's new digs, which is a hugely exciting event to come. It's also an excellent opportunity to go deeper and more broadly into the history of the sport beyond what it was even before it left the wilds of Oneonta, New York, and went sort of into hiding for a couple of years. There are things like the MISL and indoor soccer that have been, frankly, ignored or not sort of given its due because it was and is part of the history of the sport, and actually maybe part of its future as well if futsal, for example, comes back as a pro sport in a couple of years. We talk about broadcasting, right? So in the case of soccer, you have a ton of folks, whether it's Bob Carpenter or Vern Lundquist or Al Troutwig and JP Dellacamera. And we just got a whole bunch of folks who have been part of the television and radio landscape who have gone on to sort of higher perches, shall we say, in all of sports that either got their start or, were very instrumental in being part of, maybe even still part of the soccer broadcasting landscape. And that too should be celebrated and remembered and gone a little bit more deeply into. So, and by the way, that's not just for soccer. Let's be frank. We talked about all of our past episodes and things like the ABA, in basketball and the WHA and hockey and these are all, these things, these leagues, these teams, the events behind and during some of these things may not be around anymore. But the reality is they're all part of the history. They're all part of the fabric of what we know now today as the pro sports that we know and love. And I'm not saying that everything is worth remembering, and frankly, you shouldn't be, maybe swept under the rug a bit, perhaps. But again, those who ignore history are doomed to repeat it. And we think very seriously about some of the things that we treat as frivolity here on this show, but are actually very, very important to the ongoing nature and storylines of the sports that we know and love. So, if anything on this show, besides keeping you entertained and staving off boredom for a couple of hours each week, we at least maybe have a raison d'etre for doing some of this stuff, and that's to keep sort of history alive, especially that which has been largely ignored or forgotten as leagues and teams have come and gone, and that's why we're here. So thank you so much for listening this far. We want to thank our friends at Podfly Productions, in particular, The Good Doctor. You know him, you love him, you can't live without him. I certainly can't. His name is Jerry Payne, The Good Doctor, and without him, I would not be able to bring you these shows every week. So thank you, Jerry, for putting all these pieces together. And of course, make sure you go to goodseatsstillavailable.com. Check us out. All our social feeds are there at Good Seats Still. That's on Twitter. Good Seats Still available on Instagram. And of course, on Facebook, we've got a page devoted to us as well. We thank you for listening. Take care, everybody. We'll talk to you next week. And until then, enjoy the World Cup, and we'll see you soon.